Hi class, so today I'm going to be talking to you about an article that I wrote. This was based off of a 3-year study that was my dissertation and eventually became one of my first publications. And this piece is going to tell us a bit about advocacy, protest, and the politics of race and social movements, and hopefully support some of what you've been learning about in the unit. So these are our learning objectives for the lecture today. By the end of the lecture, you should be able to explain how social movement organizations make strategic decisions, understand the relationship between social movement identity theory and systemic racism theory, define colorblind ideology and racism evasiveness, explain how organizations balance solidarity and conflict, evaluate how qualitative researchers use multiple data sources to build theory, and apply social movement theory to real-world advocacy organizations. So this article demonstrates how researchers can combine multiple theoretical frameworks, use them to generate an original concept, and then support that concept through triangulated qualitative evidence. This article may be especially useful to you because it shows that theory is not simply something reviewed in a literature review, for example. It's a tool for understanding what researchers observe in the field. So my article begins with a paradox. The organization that I studied was progressive, it was multiracial, and explicitly concerned with inequality. Activists were working in communities heavily affected by racial disparities, yet members rarely discussed racism directly. So my question is, why would an interracial social movement organization avoid talking about racism when many of the problems it fights are clearly racialized? And this question matters because social movement organizations are often assumed to challenge injustice directly. So my article suggests that organizations may sometimes avoid discussing injustice even while they're fighting it. The first major framework that I used came from social movement theory, some of the theories that you've been reading about, in fact. So the key idea is that movements depend on collective identities when I'm looking at social movement identity theory. People must develop a sense of who we are, what we stand for, what unites us, and they have to create shared identities to maintain solidarity. So those are key identities from the social movement identity theory framing. I'm also drawing within this framework research specifically from sociologist Paul Lichterman. And Lichterman argued that organizational cultures vary. Some organizations encourage open discussion, debate, recognition of differences, and others emphasize unity, common goals, strategic action. He comes up with a concept called community interest politics and the characteristics of an organizational culture that relies on community interest politics, that they focus on action rather than discussion. They emphasize common interests, they downplay internal differences, and they avoid controversial topics. So I find that the organization and coalition that I studied, so it was a main organization, which I call the Center for a Fair Economy. And that organization developed a community labor organization, which was its coalition, and that I call Community Labor Alliance. Both of these, the organization and the coalition, fit Lichterman's model. So you should note here that identity is not only about race, gender, or class, it's also strategically constructed by organizations. So in this case, the organization built a collective identity around community, economic justice, their shared interests, rather than racial identity. The second framework that I employed in this research came from racism theory. So I'm drawing specifically here from past work by Joe Fagan, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and Noel Cazenave. The key idea here is that racism is not simply about individual prejudice. Instead, it's historical, institutional, structural, and embedded in social systems. Some examples of this include racism and housing segregation. Housing segregation isn't about one or two individuals having prejudiced attitudes. It's not just about one or two individually racist lenders, bank lenders, for example. It's about a history of segregating practices and racist implementation of policies that didn't benefit Black GIs, for example, returning from their service from within the military, and how that impacted their ability to get housing to the same degree that white men could. Employment discrimination, unequal school systems. Again, it's not just about one or two racist teachers or leaders, people on the school board. It's deeper than that. It is also tied to residential segregation and has a history. Environmental inequality. So my article is showing that the university hospital system that the coalition was posed against historically benefited from policies that disproportionately harmed Black and Latino communities in school segregation, for example, in housing segregation. And so the organization is operating within a context that is shaped by systemic racism. And this is where the article becomes especially valuable to students who are thinking about theoretical frameworks and synthesizing theoretical frameworks to study issues like social injustice. Rather than using social movement theory alone or racism theory alone, I combined them. So social movement theory explains why organizations value solidarity. Systemic racism theory explains why racism remains embedded in institutions. Taken together, they explain something new, a concept that I co-developed with Noel Kazaneh. He developed his work on racism, blindness, and invasiveness, and I develop it here within my project of looking at these interracial social movement organizations. So it's explaining this new idea of racism evasiveness, and that's the central contribution of the article. I'm arguing that previous scholars often combine several concepts under the term colorblind racism. And to really understand it, we have to separate all of the concepts that are kind of thrown together within this concept of colorblind racism. So I separate these things out, and this is one of my unique contributions that's different from what other authors have done. So I say first there is systemic racism. That's the underlying system of racial oppression. Second, there's colorblind ideology. That's perhaps a well-intended belief that race should not matter. And third, there's racism evasiveness. That's the practical outcome, that the outcome of believing that race shouldn't matter as an ideal results in avoiding any discussion of racism. So this is one of the major conceptual innovations of my article. The organization that I'm studying is facing competing pressures. The first pressure is how to address racism. Members do recognize in their materials and their conversations with me that there is housing discrimination and that is racist discrimination. They recognize employment inequality. They recognize unequal health outcomes and environmental racism. The second pressure is maintaining interracial solidarity. How do they recognize these controversial issues, but at the same time maintain interracial solidarity? They fear that explicitly addressing racism will lead to internal conflict, division between groups, public backlash. And so the result is that the organization adopts racism evasive strategies. And by doing that, they fight racial inequity, but they avoid explicitly saying that they are, naming racism, discussing it internally, explicitly. And I characterize this as walking the walk, but don't talk the talk. And in my interviews with organization members, they are saying we don't really have to talk about racism because we're doing it in the work. We walk our walk, so we don't have to talk the talk. So people often assume movements choose tactics because they're most effective. And this article is demonstrating something different. I'm showing that strategies are shaped by culture. The organization believes talking about racism may create conflict, it's going to divide members, alienate allies, reduce legitimacy. And these are all valid concerns. But therefore, the organization strategically frames issues as economic inequality, community development, jobs, healthcare, rather than racism. So this is a framing strategy. Framing theory within the larger body of social movement theory work argues that movements package issues in ways that attract support. So this article is suggesting that colorblind ideology influences movement framing. So in other words, the broader racist culture shapes movement strategy. And this is extending social movement theory by showing that movements respond not only to political opportunities, it's not just political process, but also to dominant racial ideologies. So a lot of the research in social movement work has examined organizational culture, and a lot of the management work looks at organizational culture within workplaces. But what I'm showing is that the external racist culture, which has a history, acts upon that internal organizational culture and then produces racism evasive actions. One of the strongest aspects of this article is the use of triangulation. So what is triangulation? It's using multiple sources of evidence to evaluate the same phenomenon. And researchers do this because no single source is going to tell the whole story. So the first data source that I used was participant observation. So it was 3 years of ethnographic fieldwork. And here I was observing meetings, rallies, press conferences, community events, and these observations showed that members rarely discussed racism publicly. But then I did in-depth interviews. This is the second data source. I conducted 25 interviews with participants, and they revealed something different when I spoke to members privately one-on-one. It showed that they understood racism, they experienced racism, they recognized structural inequalities, and this finding was crucial because without the interviews, I might have concluded that the members were simply ignoring racism, which is what a lot of the research on colorblind racism had shown up to this point. And instead, interviews were showing that they were consciously and strategically avoiding internal discussions on racism. And then the third data source was organizational documents. So I examined reports, organizational materials, meeting minutes, public statements, and these documents contained discussions of racial disparities, health inequalities, employment inequalities, and again, the evidence suggested members recognized racism. The fourth data source was media coverage, and here I compared what the organization said publicly, how issues were represented in media coverage, not just by the organization, but their opponent as well. How did the opponent represent themselves and represent the organization? And what was some of the back and forth discussions that they got into? And this allowed me to see how messages changed across contexts. And so we have a kind of methodological strength in triangulation. It's again showing us how we can bring together conflicting information and get the story from this. So within qualitative research, it's very iterative. You think you have one story, but then as you gather more evidence, that story changes. And so you're getting closer and closer to the truth in this research. So imagine that I only conducted interviews. If I only conducted interviews, I might conclude that members care very deeply about racism. And imagine that I only conducted observations. From the observations, I might conclude that members never discuss racism and that they don't really have a keen awareness of this. Both conclusions would be incomplete. The triangulation that I conducted revealed the contradiction. Privately, members recognized racism. Publicly, they avoided discussing racism. And this becomes one of the central findings in my articles. And one way where I saw this very clearly was in how they recruited a diverse membership. It wasn't just diverse in terms of race, it was also diverse in terms of faith, religion, and in terms of social class. So if I were to go by just a handful of the interviews, some of the members were telling me, we don't even take into account race. We don't care. We just, everybody recruits everybody. But it didn't make sense to me because they had pastors and they specifically recruited from those pastors' congregations, and those churches were racially segregated. The neighborhoods were racially segregated. And it seemed to me by observing that and going on recruitment activities with them, that they were recruiting and paying attention to how they matched people interracially, how they even matched people of different genders, and how that mattered in building an interracial diverse membership. And so through talking to more members and doing more observations, I found that they were navigating the racist segregation within the neighborhoods by actually consciously making members step outside of their comfort zones, making members requiring that they attend house meetings that were outside of their neighborhoods, and maybe starting from recruiting from your own networks, but then building out and matching you with other members from different neighborhoods and from different racial backgrounds to consciously build this interracial membership. And they came up with a really strong strategy to navigate the racial segregation of the neighborhoods and the racial segregation of social networks that we still see today, but they were really careful, hesitant to talk about that, even though it was a really strong strategy that they came up with. The pressure to avoid discussions on racism also made them avoid the really recognizing the strength of their own interracial membership and how they achieved that. So examining that and looking at the triangulation in this article and how this data is brought together really shows an excellent example of how theory can emerge from comparing multiple forms of evidence. So students often ask, how do I actually use theory in a research project? And this article offers a model of how to do that through various steps. So step one, I identified a puzzle. Why do anti-racist organizations avoid talking about racism when racism is a central part of what they do, racism and anti-racist work? Step two, use theory to generate explanations. So I used social movement theory that showed me how solidarity matters. And then I used systemic racism theory that showed how colorblind ideology shapes public discourse. Step three, you collect multiple forms of evidence. So I collected observations, interviews, documents, media, and I analyzed them. And then step four, you compare the evidence. What people say privately differs from what they say publicly. And then step five, develop a new concept from all of this, iterative process in the data analysis. And the new concept that I expanded upon in this project was racism evasiveness. So this shows theory building in practice. So let me leave you with some key takeaways of this work. One, the theoretical contribution. The article synthesizes social movement identity theory with systemic racism theory to explain organizational strategy. So it gives you a model of how you might do that in your own work. It offers a conceptual contribution. I introduced the concept of racism evasiveness, the avoidance of explicitly naming racism while still working on issues shaped by racism. And it makes a social movement contribution. So there's a contribution to studies of racism, and there's a contribution to studies of social movements. And here I'm arguing that movement strategies are shaped not only by organizational culture, but also by broader racial ideologies. There's, in addition, a methodological contribution. I successfully triangulate ethnographic observations, interviews, organizational documents, and media coverage to reveal a contradiction between public behavior and private beliefs. So the broader lesson here is that for social movement researchers, theory and methods work together. And theory helps to identify what to look for, and triangulated evidence helps explain why activists behave the way they do. So this article demonstrates how combining social movement theory with systemic racism theory can produce new insights about advocacy, protest, and organizational strategy in contemporary social movement.